So when I was at last year's API World, I managed to corner the program manager for Nginx, and I asked him what was the purpose of using Nginx as a API gateway. In fact, what is the purpose of an API gateway altogether? When in fact the API server can handle most of it, because when you actually do a redirect from the API server back to the API gateway, you drop a thread, have to reissue the request back to the API server, and that dropped thread takes about 30 seconds to a minute to let go of all of its resources, and you have to reissue the request, the session, and everything, and go back in. Plus, the API gateway cannot synchronize its schema with the API server's endpoint data. And I pointed this out and I showed him all this information and the security issues that this causes, and he's like, no, you're 100% correct. In fact, most enterprises do not use an API gateway. And I'm like, yeah, I know, because I help a lot of them. And in fact, a lot of enterprises use the BAPI framework. And I consult with a lot of them. And he's like, well, okay, I didn't know who you were. And so he's like, yeah, no, you're 100% right. And I'm like, yeah, so why are you telling people to use an API gateway when it's not in their best interest for scale or speed? And he's like, well, some people like to use that. And I'm like, right, okay, but I mean, for, people who are architecting out things, why are you doing this? He's just like, well, some people, that was his answer. It's just, some people like to do that. And so today, I thought this would be another good point to do this, because I saw that he's releasing another video with this exact same speech that he gave at API World, saying, yay, API gateways, and giving this all over again, talking about API gateways, what they are, what they do, what they're for, and the pros and the cons. The intent pros versus the actual cons of an API gateway. And I'm going to break them all down, talk about what an API gateway is, what it was intended to do versus what it actually does, and the cons of an API gateway. So we're going to go into that today and cover that in great detail. So pay close attention, because you're going to find this one really interesting. All right, so let's have some fun. Welcome back to APIs in the Morning. I, as always, am your ever-amiable host, Owen Rubel, and today I wanted to talk about API gateways. What are they? What do they do? What are they for? What are the pros and cons? So, basically, what they are for, I wanted to get into that more. But first I wanted to get into architecture, API architecture. So, the two major bottlenecks for API architecture are I/O and CPU. I/O being input and output, and CPU just processing power and processing all the processing overhead that you have. And by input and output, the things that you do with APIs is that you will have excessive input data and output data. And this is one of the things that they talk about with OWASP. In case you saw the last 2 weeks videos, you'll have excessive input and output data that you have to do a lot of processing for. And we talk about that in CPUs. Excessive headers that you're sending and people are sending, that you have to process for. Excessive routing. People are doing lots of redirects, or like for instance with GraphQL. GraphQL will send a request to every single table that it needs data from, and then it will knit them all together. And that's a ton of calls that you have to make. That's why GraphQL is really, really slow, except when it's caching. But then you're not really calling GraphQL. You're calling a cache, and anybody can set up a cache. I use caches. And excessive traffic. And that's something else that you have to set up for that. That's basically a load balancer that you set up for that. But that's part of architecture, and that's why we're talking about this. The CPU processing, you have to do security handling in your APIs. You have to check the roles for every single endpoint. You have to do message routing at the end of the output. Every single call, you have to send the response for. And again, this is why we use a message queue. It's separating that output out to a separate architectural service, data pre-processing too, and header checks. And this is what this is all about, is that we separate out all this excessive CPU and I/O to separate architectural services. And this is what API Gateway, much like the message queue, is for. It was supposed to handle excessive services that the API server is handling as a separate architectural service, so that the API server had more CPU just to handle what it needed to do, which was business logic, and then sending out the response, which then the message queue could handle as a separate architectural service. And that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense as an architectural service. And we'll go into that. It's pre-processing functionality as a service, and separating that all out as a separate functionality and a separate service. And that's what the API Gateway was supposed to do and supposed to act like. But there are pros to that and cons to that, and we're going to get into that. So, as I mentioned before, I was going to talk about the pros and cons of the API Gateway. And as we were going through it, I inadvertently talked about a lot of the pros. So the pros of the API Gateway is that you're taking a lot of that pre-processing and moving it to a separate architectural service, so that you're freeing up your API server a lot of the processing, so that it can focus mainly on the business logic. So it has a bit more processing power. Now, the amount of processing power that is available to it by freeing up some of this is nominal. When you actually do benchmark tests on this with like Java or something like that, which is what I do the benchmark tests with, you will get, depending, between 1 to 3 seconds off of every 100,000 requests. Now that's pretty good, but off of every 100,000 requests, that's not that much. But it's still good. It's a nice improvement. And I would say, at the same point, in its defense, that every improvement like that, you're shaving off for thousands and thousands and thousands of requests when you're scaling up. Now that's positive, right? Well, at the same time, you have to balance that out with the cons. Now, what are the cons? So keep in mind that when you have a API let me go ahead and show you an example here. All of your data for your API is bound at your controllers, and I'll show you an example controller here in Java. The data is bound at your controllers and at your functions. So if in this example we have an employee controller and a list, this is the path for employees, and a path for post mapping and list mapping. This is a RESTful example. So, get employees ID, put employees ID, etc., etc., etc. And also, you will put your security in here as well, security functionality as to how it can be called, and so on and so forth. So, right here is all of the information for how this is called. This is the central version of truth for how this is called. And what your gateway does is that it duplicates all this information in OpenAPI or RAML or API Blueprint or things like that. It duplicates that in their schema so that it has a copy of this information, but that copy never ever syncs. And you can see me demonstrating as well in BAPI dynamic reloading. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. See if I can pull that up. We'll just go into this real quick and see if I can go to someplace.
You can see.
No, we're not even going to go into it. But what I cover in this video is that if you abstract that data away from your controllers to a separate layer, you can actually synchronize that with all the other services in your architecture. And that is how you turn this con into a pro. But as is, the API gateway is still a con because it can't synchronize that data. You can turn that con into a pro if at your API service you abstract this data from your controllers so that you can synchronize from your API server to all of your other services using things like webhooks or what. But as is, your API gateway is still a con because it's a huge security violation until your API server can push out this data to all the other services. And that's a huge con.